Hey friends, it's Lauren Taylor. Thank you so much for joining me in my craft room today. I'm grateful to have you here for another video. I'm going to be sharing some new supplies to make a Christmas tree shaker card. I'm so excited about this tree cover plate and the addition of more sentiment strips for Christmas. I also have the new Merry Script die and the beautiful Christmas tree mix to be my little shaker insides. So let's get started with some ink blending. I thought cracked pistachio matched super well with the green little jimmies in the Christmas tree mix. So I went ahead and just kind of squished some ink on my glass mat, sprayed it with water, and I'm picking up that ink with some watercolor cardstock. I did trim my cardstock to be slightly larger than A2 because I'm going to use that tree cover plate to die cut out. So I wanted to make sure it was a little bigger. I didn't have to worry about lining up my paper exactly behind the die. In between these two layers of ink, I did use my heat gun to dry some of that cracked pistachio ink so the ink would layer nicely on top of each other. I went ahead and cleaned up the watery ink, and then I'm just using a domed foam blender to add more of that cracked pistachio distress oxide around all four sides, and then a little bit in the middle where I thought it looked a little too white. I wanted to bring in more of that green. I'm also going to bring in a darker green distress oxide. This is Lucky Clover. I love Lucky Clover and cracked pistachio together. I think they make a really good pair. And this time I'm using an acetate sheet to pick up the ink off of my glass mat. So again, squish that ink onto the glass and then sprayed it with water. And I'm using this acetate sheet kind of like a stamp to pick up that ink and then stamp it right onto my background. This is just a more controlled way of adding the ink so it can go exactly where I want it to instead of just squishing it down and seeing where it pops up. This allows me to add ink anywhere I want to onto this piece of cardstock. I also use some of that leftover ink to add some splatter, but I'm also going to grab my Dome Foam blender for Lucky Clover and add a little bit to the edges of the cardstock as well. Once I'm done adding this little bit of ink, I'm pretty happy with the green, so I'm going to bring in some mica sprays. I wanted to add a little bit of shine, but also bring in either pink or yellow that will match that Christmas tree mix, and I end up settling on the really pretty sugar plum color. Sugary gumdrop. That's what it is. And I think it's so pretty. It totally matches the lighter pink of the clay confetti in the Christmas tree mix. So I went ahead and placed my cardstock into an extra box that I use for splattering, and I'm just spraying this mica spray just kind of randomly around my background, and then I'll also take off the top and splatter it on as well. And this mica stain spray is from the holiday or the Christmas set number 2. I'm going to pick up the excess of the mica spray with a towel because I didn't really want it to be vibrant. I wanted a nice subtle shine on my green background, and I really love how it turned out. So I'm going to go ahead and set it aside to dry while I work on the sentiment of my card. I'm using the brand new Sentiment Strips Christmas stamp set, and of course going to be grabbing my sentiment strip dies. I love that Pretty Pink Posh is coming out with more sentiments that fit perfectly in these different size and types of sentiment dies. I'm also going to use the new Merry script. So I wanted to pick a sentiment that I thought would go pretty well with Merry, and I settle on have a holly jolly Christmas. And now this is a bit of a longer sentiment, so I'm going to grab all of the longer ones that I think layer really nice together, which is the really thin rectangle, the rectangle with the stitch, and then the scallop with the stitch. I picked some different cardstocks that I keep in my kind of leftover scrap stash in this pink color, yellow, and then more of an orangey red pink color. It's kind of like a dark salmon, and I just thought that these matched really well with the other clay pieces in the Christmas tree mix. So I'm going to be doing all of my die cutting from these, as well as some white for the sentiment strip. So I know that I want to die cut Mary out of the pink and the darker kind of pink red color, but I wasn't sure about how I wanted to die cut my scallop and stitched rectangle. So I went ahead and cut them both out of pink and yellow. And then I cut the thinnest of the rectangles out of some white cardstock because that's what I'm going to stamp my sentiment on. Now this is a teeny tiny little strip, so I'm going to use the extra or the negative space of my cutout to line up my sentiment inside my MISTI, and then I will place that strip inside the cut opening. I'm using a green ink. I picked a VersaFine Clair. This is green Oasis, and I wanted it to match as best as I could to the Distress Oxide colors that I made or that I put together on my background, and I think it matches pretty well. So now that my sentiment is all ready to go, my background is dry, and we're going to move into die cutting now my shaker cover plate. So I'm grabbing this brand new tree cover plate, and there are little tiny dies that you can cut out of the two trees on the top row, but I'm not going to be using the tree cutouts. I just want the actual plate cover die cut, so I'm not too worried about cutting those out right now. I did run this through my die cut machine, but I am using a pretty thick watercolor cardstock, and it just didn't cut all the way through the first time because the paper is so thick. So I'm going to run it through again, but this time using a metal shim. So if you're using a thicker cardstock and you're having trouble, just grab an extra shim, run it through your die cut machine again, and you'll find that it cuts out perfectly. So you can see the excess around the edges just pulled off so nicely, and the rest of my trees are punching out perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and take all those trees, and I'm going to save them because I think they're going to make a perfect card. I love the color that they turned out from cutting them out of this green colored background, so they're going to make a great card in the future. I have some white pattern paper that has some light gray kind of speckly look on it, and I'm going to use that to be the backside of my shaker. I did so much detail work on my cover. I wanted my background of my shaker to be a little more subtle, so just using a pattern paper is going to work perfectly. I'm also trimming down some acetate to be the cover of my shaker, and I did trim the white pattern paper and this acetate to be slightly smaller than A2 in size, so that way I don't have to worry too much about lining up my edges perfectly when I assemble the shaker. I'm adding some double-sided adhesive around all four sides on the back side of my tree cutout, and I also added a couple strips in the center since this is a full panel. I wanted to make sure my acetate really stuck to the back side of this die cut. I'm going to peel off all the release paper, and then I will layer on the acetate to the back side. This will be the cover of our card and the front of the shaker. I'm grabbing some foam adhesive. This is a 3mm thick foam adhesive, so there will be plenty of room for all of my shaker bits to move freely. And I'm going to add the foam adhesive to all four sides of my rectangle. So I'm going to make sure that I have each piece that I add, they are snug up against the previous one I lay down because I don't want my shaker bits to go anywhere. So I just make sure they're really butted up against each other. And then after I lay down the foam for all four sides, I'm going to add foam across the panel in between my tree layers. So I will have 3 little shaker wells, and that way I don't have to fill up my shaker card like with my whole entire confetti mix. I just need to add a little bit to each 3 of the sections, and it will look like the shaker card is really full. I'm using a little pokey tool to help me peel off the release paper off this foam, and then I will grab my Christmas tree mix, and I'm going to give it a good shake to make sure all of the different types of confetti and clay pieces in here will mix together nicely, and I have like a good amount of each kind in all 3 of these little shaker wells. Once I'm happy with how much confetti I have, I'm grabbing that white pattern paper and I'm going to close up my shaker. I'm going to give it a nice press and make sure my foam really adheres to my paper and none of my shaker bits will fall out anywhere. So here is a quick little close-up of my shaker. As you can see, it looks super full because I have 3 different shaker areas, and it just helps not, completely use up your clay confetti mix on one card. So I narrowed down how I wanted to layer my sentiment together. I'm going with the pink scallop and the yellow rectangle. So I'll go ahead and grab my liquid adhesive and glue those 2 pieces together. I also really like the pink as a drop shadow behind my red cardstock, so I'm going to grab my tweezers to hold my red Mary die cut, and I will use my liquid adhesive again. It has a very fine point tip on it, so I'm able to trace the letters with glue and then layer that on top of the pink one. And I'm just shifting it over a little bit so that that light pink kind of just peeks out from behind the red pink die cut Mary. Now we can start adding these sentiments to the front of our card. I'm trying to figure out how exactly I want it laid out and make sure that my Mary, won't be covered by my sentiment strip, and I'm pretty happy with how it's looking. So I'll go ahead and glue down the stamped sentiment to the center of that stack, the yellow cardstock with the pink scallop. I love these dies. I love that you can create so many different sentiments die cuts with the different sentiment stamps, but also just the different shapes. There's scallops, there's banners, there's just the rectangles. It's a lot of fun to play with. I'm going to go ahead and center this sentiment to my card. So I have it lined up on my grid mat, and I'm doing my best to get that sentiment strip directly in the middle of the card. And then I will add Mary just above that. I'm gluing it the same way like when I glued the 2 layers of the word together, and then using my tweezers to help me get that placed on top of the sentiment strip. I was going to add my pops of color, but then I realized I should probably get it on a card base first, and I noticed that I didn't get the background of my shaker perfectly lined up, but that's no problem. I'm just grabbing some scissors and cutting it at a bit of an angle to trim off that excess paper that was showing. I have an A2 card base, so I'll go ahead and really enforce that score line, the fold of my card, and I'm going to use some strong adhesive to add that glue to my card base so I can add my A2 cover shaker to the card base. Once I have that on, now I'll add the pops of color so that way I can set this card aside and make sure my little glitter pops of color will dry before I touch it again, because I have a tendency to just wipe my hand through pops of color. This is a really pale glittery pink, and I thought it just matched really well with the rest of the pink on the card. I'm giving them a little tap so that way they look more like enamel dots in a dome instead of that Hershey Kiss look that sometimes liquid embellishment can get. And here is the final shaker card. I hope you had fun making this card with me today and you experiment with your inks and different fun colors for Christmas. I am just absolutely loving the new Pretty Pink Posh Christmas products, and I sure hope you are too. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll click like, and if you're new here, I hope you'll subscribe and come back. As always, you can find everything I use down below in the description box. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye!